So getting on then to employment in general practice. Firstly, because this is quite different compared to the hospital, so I just thought I'd speak to how people actually get paid in general practice. So it's a very different arrangement. So as a registrar, you are an employee. So you're employed by the clinic until fellowship, and the NTCER outlines your minimum terms for this employment. You could also be a salaried doctor. So it's similar to being in the hospital, you're a salaried doctor from there. There's also the single employer model, as we alluded to before, and unlike being employed by the clinic, you're employed by the state health system end to end, and the award is equivalent to your hospital equivalent. Then when you fellow, a lot of GPs are employed as a tenant GP, independent contractor, some of the language you might hear previously. And this is as a sole trader where you've got an ABN. And it's kind of in a way like renting a room at a practice. So, for example, I'd get 100% of my billings, but then I'd pay the practice a service fee for their services that they're providing me through having the room, the admin support, nursing support from there. But that's once you've fellowed, not while you're a registrar. The NTCER, as we said, this is the minimum terms and conditions for the employment of GPs at registrars and rural generalist registrars. Every 2 years, we negotiate this with GPSA, so that's General Practice Supervisors Australia, and this covers the working hours, education, supervision, remuneration, and dispute resolution as well. It's important to know that the NTCER is the minimum terms. You can negotiate higher depending on what your practice is able to offer you as well. While it's not an award, it's a set of mandatory, nationally consistent, agreed terms that are, as we said in the previous slide, applicable across all pathways apart from SEM in Queensland. From a registrar point of view, the way registrars get paid is a bit different. So you've got the base rate there, and that's there because there'll be times where you're taken out of your practice, so you're not billing as much because you're attending important things such as your education with your college. So your base rate is there as a safety net. So you either get your base rate or a percentage of billings, depending on what is higher. Then there's these things called SIPs and PIPs. It's not the idea of tonight to go into them. They're a bit more complex, often under, or at the moment still under a bit of a review. The idea is to know that they're there and have a discussion as well if it comes up with your practice about them. Then you get super on top of this from there. The other thing to be aware of as well is from 2026.1, so the start of next year, there's also an incentive for GP trainees of 30 grand for coming into general practice, and paternity leave, study leave as well. The NTCER, as we said, it covers a number of things. So remuneration, so your base rates, and that, as I mentioned as well, there's that 30 grand incentive for new GPT ones from next year. It also talks further to the other payments as a SIPs and PIPs, the specifics of annual leave, education release, and study and parental leave. So it's a good one to have a read through, especially those main sections, but before starting on this side of process, but we'll talk to a bit more of it tonight. So common queries that we get. Often I found it was around annual leave. So what this means in general practice as a registrar is you get 4 years weeks per year pro rata. So meaning if you're half time, so 0.5, it's 2 weeks per year from there. And this can be taken in advance. So meaning that unlike unlike small businesses where you have to accrue leave, you can take leave with negotiation with the practice before you've actually accrued that leave. If you don't take your leave, it must be paid out at the end of a training semester if you've got a 6-month placement. And if you're moving between practices, your leave does not follow you because you've got 2 different employment contracts from there. Admin time's another one that we get common questions on. It's basically half an hour a session typically being 3 to 4 hours, like a morning or afternoon block of work. And there's specifics on overtime and after hours as well. Cool. Moving on to the next bit. Working hours conditions is also really good to suss out with the practice, because while you might have an ideal in your head of what suits you, while a lot of practices will try to very well be accommodating, they've got other challenges on their side of things too. So, for example, if a practice can only take a part-time registrar, they might only have specific days that registrar can work. So nutting out this side of things at an interview can also be useful as well. So particularly if the practice has got multiple locations, what's the breakup of that? How are you expected to be between both sites? How does the technology marry up as well? Is there any expectation for after hours or nursing home or on-call work? And if there's nursing home work, worthwhile as well having a conversation about what this works on the ground. It can be a lot if you're expected to see your list, respond to calls from the nursing home, and then go to the nursing home after your list, compared to, is there a week blocked off and that is just the week that you're looking after the nursing home residents. So there's a big difference within the admin side of structure from there, and you really need those admin processes and practice supports to help you in that, especially when you're getting going from that. Equipment's always a good conversation to have as well, just to clarify that before getting and going. And in particular too, if there's any annual leave dates that you've got in mind, especially if they're up front early on in the term, important, I'd even do it at interview, having a conversation up front about that, because practices just like to be organised. So it's not, they know you're going to take annual leave at some point during the term, as showing that you've thought about it, having that side of discussion. In my experience, a lot of practices have much preferred that, compared to then if you start and then on day one you're saying, oh, by the way, next week I'm having 3 weeks off, please. Work with them from there. And on the working hours conditions too, this is difference which will come into key people towards the end. This is more in the practice manager side of realm. So practice manager works with the day-to-day runnings of the practice. Your supervisor, while they may or may not also be the clinic owner, the supervisor, education, medicine. From there, they often, depending on the structure of the practice, there's a different role to the practice manager. So the practice manager is also a person who's really important to have a good relationship with. I found it interesting when I worked as a registrar advisor, where people had contacted us and there were queries where things just weren't working out at the practice. There'd been miscommunications that had then got out of control. And I found it astounding sometimes about how many people just hadn't had a conversation early on with a practice manager about it. That often a face-to-face conversation in an open relationship where you can talk about, hey, by the way, I had 3 people booked in for 15 minutes. It wasn't working for me. What can we do so that make sure the admin team work with me so I can see patients accordingly? Whatever the issue be, an early conversation in person often stops issues from snowballing. Has that also been your experience, Phil?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the practice manager is so key. And I suppose something it's a bit of a delicate relationship. I think coming from the hospital system, there's often quite a clear distinction between medical staff and non-medical staff. And except for maybe talking to the people who make the rosters every now and again, you don't have a huge amount to do maybe with the non-medical staff in the hospital system. Whereas the practice manager is a non-clinical person, but they are your manager. They are the person who looks after you.
And partly remuneration, it's really making sure that your employment in your contract is in line with the minimum conditions outlined in the NTCER. That yes, you can always try to negotiate above that, but it's very dependent on what the practice is able to offer as well. From there. And then I'd also, wherever possible, speak to the current registrar who's working there. Again, with the caveat that not every practice is going to be the right fit for the right registrar. So that's where take any feedback with a bit of salt. But you'll often hear different information from registrars as a different view who's worked in that compared to other side of people who work in the practice as well. Alrighty, so interviews and how to approach them. So there's a lot in this side of space when it comes to GP training and practices because it's such a different environment compared to the hospital. And unlike the hospital as well, you've got a key supervisor where compared to where your head of unit, where you may have seen them once, if that, there's a different relationship with someone who's one of their roles within the practice is there to support and teach you. So that relationship with your supervisor is really key. So you want to know when your education is going to be built in and ensure it's locked out is one of the things to check that that's happening. When's your mandatory teaching time? When you have questions in practice, how do you ask them? When I've done ECT visits, it's a bit of a yellow flag for me when some of the registrars haven't been able to get help in a timely way and kind of stand in a corridor waiting for someone to open their door to ask a question, that you need to have good processes to be able to get good advice in a timely when you're in this training side of capacity. And then it's also within the practice itself that while, yes, you get your mandatory days and education that's funded under the AGPT, it's also the practice itself. So it can be worthwhile knowing and discussing, does the practice hold any journal clubs or other side of education aspects? Or are the doctors in the practice also happy to answer questions? What's that side of teaching approach for the practice? And then do you have any particular learning goals within that side of practice? If, for example, skin excisions, is there someone who can help you there with upskilling? If there are any doctors who are doing marinas, are you able to observe in that area as well? If there's any particular areas you could learn from, and particularly any other supports that you need from a skill-wise too, that what's the makeup from an education perspective of the practice to give you the best possible training experience. Then the culture. I think I've heard lots of things about culture, but I think at the end of the day, it's something that you feel. So when you walk into the practice, what's the general vibe? Is this somewhere that you could see yourself working? The retention rate of past registrars is not a perfect meter for that, but it can also be a meter for a good practice as well, where people who've worked there previously have come back to work there when they've been fellowed. And again, similarly for the turnover of other staff, like nurses and admin, that while there is naturally a changeover of staff in any side of business, how quickly is this happening? So of course, practices at different times will go through different patches, but how long have some of the people worked in the practice for? Do they enjoy what they do? What's the culture of the place like? Are there any additional side of things like social footy tipping? What's good about this place that gives you that side of feel of this is a good general practice that's going to be supportive with a good culture? Workflow is another thing to consider. And this is more about the day-to-day runnings of how it works. So what are the processes for checking results when you're away on leave? Is there a buddy system? Is there a remote access? A lot of the practices will have approaches to these, but it's a good thing just to learn and talk about it. So that way you also know how different things work in different places and what's going to be the approach for you. So even scheduling patients, that a lot of practices now have things online. It's an extra headache sometimes to not have online systems, with general practice being really at the forefront with a lot of the digital health approaches. But then it's also nursing support. So are you expected to do, for example, child immunisations by yourself or care plans by yourself? Or is there nursing support and workflows for that? And then the software that the practice uses, so what's their view on AI scribes or other digital health options, noting that it's not recommended to use this in GPT-1. But there's again, every practice has got a different approach to this, so worthwhile having a conversation to see what this side of things also like.